Harvard Divinity School.
Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, April 7th, 2025.
I'm so delighted to see so many of you here today. My name is Hilary Rantisi, and I'm the Associate Director of the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative here at the Harvard Divinity School. I wanted to welcome you to the last of our new book event series that we do in the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. We have one more event this semester at the end of April, so look out for an invitation to that and hope we see many of you there. Before I introduce the program, I wanted to thank my colleagues without whom arrangements for tonight's event would have been possible. So Areem, Tammy, Natalie, Delise, Perlay, and Brian behind the camera there. So please join me in thanking them. So some of you may be new to the Divinity School or to the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative, and I just thought I'd say a few words just to introduce you to our work and to understand why this book is part of our series. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative centralizes an analysis of structural injustice, of violence, and power in its work. And the primary case study that we've been focusing on has been on Israel Palestine. Our aim is to stretch the scholarly discourse around religion and the practices of peace building, and to examine the decolonial potentialities of art, religion, and identity transformation. So today's book event, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, centers an analysis of power and injustice. And it is our great honor to be hosting the author, Peter Beinart, with us today. Professor Shaul Magid will be in conversation with Peter, and I will just briefly introduce them, although I don't think they need much of an introduction. So Peter Beinart, welcome home, of Cambridge, Massachusetts, is a distinguished journalist, political commentator, and professor who has become a leading voice on American politics, foreign policy, and international affairs. He's a professor of journalism and political science at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He is an editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, a contributing opinion columnist at the New York Times, a political commentator from MSNBC, and a fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He was a former editor of the New Republic and has written for The Time, Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, among many other publications. He has published 4 books: The Good Fight, Why Liberals and Only Liberals Can Win the War on Terror and Make America Great Again, published in 2006. I had to list it. The Icarus Syndrome, A History of American Hubris, 2010. I think everyone knows these books. Why? I don't need to do this introduction. The Crisis of Zionism in 2012. And today he'll be discussing his latest and 4th book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, which was just released this past January. Peter will be in conversation with Rabbi and Professor Shaul Magid, who's a visiting professor of modern Jewish studies at Harvard Divinity School, a distinguished fellow in Jewish studies at Dartmouth University, and a former fellow at faculty affiliate at the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. He's also prolific and has written many books, the latest of which is The Necessity of Exile, which is published in 2023. So I am so delighted to introduce both our guests here tonight, and I know they will have an amazing conversation, and we will open up for questions at the end. We have books for sale, so I encourage you all to get a book before they all disappear. And there's food. There will be food afterwards as well for those of you who didn't get a chance to get some before. So please join me in welcoming our guests tonight.
Thank you, Hillary. Can everybody hear me? Okay? Okay, great. Sometimes a book is more than a book. And I think in this case, this book is more than a book. And I want to just tell you a very quick anecdote before we start. But I want to say that this book really is a moment. It's an intervention. It's a provocation. And it's also an invitation. And I think that before I start, just as a caveat, I'm sure that there will be things that will be said in the next hour or so that people will disagree with. People may find offensive, one way or the other. And I think that the importance of this book as an event, as a moment, is that it does elicit a certain kind of reaction that can be part of a conversation. So I hope that we can have that conversation. So the anecdote is as follows. I posted the poster of the book on my Facebook page, which was, in some sense, a mistake, because I immediately was attacked by myriad people from all over the world, right? At which point I said, I'm mostly critical, I will say, at which point I said, how many of you have actually read the book? After which there was silence. And one person, who I actually know from many years ago, from Israel, said, I was just critiquing the description on the poster. Right? And I think that speaks in a way to something about the book, that the opposition, the resistance to the book is not what's inside it, but it's that it exists at all. And that's, I think, what is so important about the book. Not that what's inside it is not important too, but that it exists at all. I think part of the punch of the book is that it combines, I think very deftly, investigative journalism, opinion journalism, and autobiography. It's able to weave together bringing home the receipts, as an investigative journalist does, a very kind of acute and sharp analysis, which Peter does brilliantly in the book. And also, it gives you a sense of the author and your life, both your past in South Africa and in America, and what it means to be a white South African, what it means to be an American. And so altogether, it really kind of combines those three things in a way that's very powerful and also, I think, very disturbing for some. So I have like 4 or 5 questions, and I want to let you also just kind of riff on things that are happening in these walls, if you would like. And I want to begin with a question. You know, I've listened to some of the podcasts, I've listened to your Substacks, I've read the reviews, and a lot of them really are focusing on very kind of here and now, on the ground questions, either questioning your assumptions or your data. But buried in the book are also a series of conceptual ideas. And I'd like to really kind of engage those ideas, because those ideas I have not seen. So on page 68, you write as follows. Israel doesn't have a Hamas problem. Israel has a Palestinian problem. Its problem is that Israeli security and Palestinian security are interconnected. Something very suggestive about that sentence, and I want to maybe offer some historical context to get a better sense of what you think. I would say that the problem of our moment, post-October 7th, in the midst of a war, is not only a problem of Hamas, and it's not only a problem of the Palestinians. It's a problem of what the Zionists early on formulated as the Arab question. In the 1920s, when Jews were immigrating to Palestine and had in their minds to create the state, they had a problem. How are we going to create this Jewish state with this majority of non-Jews, Palestinians, Arabs? They weren't called Palestinians at that point, at least not by the Jews. And that was a problem of majoritarianism. The state was founded, Jews became the majority, but that problem remained, and that problem remains to this day. So I'd like to, if you could just tell us something about what you think about this notion of the Arab question and where it is now, and what the possibilities are moving forward.
Sure. Can you hear me? Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm really, really grateful to Hillary and Reem and everyone who made this possible. And I want to talk a little bit at some point about what I feel like is like the profound injustice of the fact that I'm here giving a talk under the auspices of a program invited by someone who, for reasons that seem to me completely unjust and indefensible, are actually going to be shut down. So I guess I'll kind of lay that as a marker for the conversation as we go forward. Sorry, it's not coming through? Okay.
You could just hold the mic.
Yeah, maybe I'll just hold it. Is this better? No? Maybe it's not working. Oh, okay.
Maybe it's not on. Did you
Maybe
check
it's
what's
not
on?
Oh. How's this? Is this better? Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Okay.
First problem
Yeah,
solved.
I feel like that. Yeah, I've never been good with mechanical objects. It's an obscure Woody Allen reference. But I'm just really, really grateful to be here with Shaul, who's a friend and a teacher, and my mother is here, which is very significant to me, and also my beloved former professor Diana Wiley was here. Is very, very meaningful to me. So and lastly, Aaron Wander, who was my colleague working on the book, who really a tremendous amount of what's in the book really owes to him, and the other extraordinary young person I worked with on the book, Nama Tenbrink. So I'm just very, very grateful, and so it's meaningful to me to be here. And like Shaul was saying, I'm also just very conscious when I look out into a crowd like this that I don't want to make the assumption that folks here necessarily agree with me. And so I'm always really touched and moved when people who strongly disagree come to listen, because as Shaul was saying, often people don't listen, and that's not a right-wing problem, right? That's just an American or a human problem. People just kind of like often much prefer to listen to people who are going to tell them what they already believe than people who don't. So if you're one of those people who's actually coming and suspects you're going to hear a lot of things you disagree with, I'm very, very grateful to you for doing that. It says in Pirkei Avot, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people," which is a line I quote a lot because I like it a lot, and because it's something that I aspire to and often fail to achieve, to do myself. On the question of the Palestinian problem, to me, I feel like so much discourse around in mainstream Jewish circles and in mainstream American political circles about Palestinians, about Gaza, about October 7th, about all kinds of things, just doesn't engage at any point with some very basic foundational truths, right? Without which it doesn't seem to me you're going to get anywhere good, right, in trying to understand what's happening, right? And One of those truths is that between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, Jews all have citizenship. They all have the right to vote for the government that has life and death control over them. They all live under civil law with due process, and they all have free movement, right? That most of the Palestinians under Israeli control, those in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, don't have any of those things, right? Certainly in the West Bank, they live under military law, even as their Jewish neighbors live with due process under civil law. In the West Bank, they need military permission to travel. They can't vote for a government that has dominion, obviously dominion over them. I love people always saying somehow people think that Palestinians in the West Bank are governed by the Palestinian Authority. Well, tell that to the Palestinian Authority when the Palestinian Authority's own officials get thrown into Israeli jails. The Palestinian Authority's own officials need Israeli military permission to travel, right? Israel can go, the IDF goes regularly into any square inch of the West Bank area, A, B, C. If there were a D, E, and F, every single square inch of the West Bank, anytime it wants, and arrest anywhere it wants, right? These mass expulsions that are now happening in like Jenin refugee camp, right? What part of the West Bank is that? That's Area A. It's supposedly the area the Palestinian Authority controls. Well, not very much, evidently, because Israel just goes in there and basically evicts tens of thousands of people. So, and in Gaza, people live under the control of the state, right? There was the state of Israel. There was this idea people had that people were not under the control of the state of Israel before October 7th, but that was clearly not true, right? Israel controls the population registry in Gaza, which means that for any person or good to go in and out of Gaza, on October 6th, Israel had to approve it. I mean, you could try to smuggle things in, right? But basically, as people said, it was a prison. It was just that it was like a prison where the prison guards had left the prison, right? So there were no longer settlers or soldiers on the ground before October 7th, right? But it was still a prison in the sense that Israel controlled everything that went in and out. Now, Egypt had a subordinate role, but even at the Rafah crossing, right, which is borders with Egypt, Israel had significant control in terms of when it went in and out. So this just basic foundational reality about the legal regime that exists, right, seems to me the starting point. You have to kind of think about violence, to think about morality, to think about how to make people safer. You have to engage with this question, right? And you have to engage with the question, right, that there have been these mass expulsions of Palestinians in 1948, again in 1967, right? And you can't make any sense of Gaza, what Gaza is, right, without understanding that most of the people in Gaza are not from Gaza. They're people whose families were expelled from what's now Israel, right? And many of them live so close to the places from which they were expelled that they can actually see those places, right, as they live in this incredibly overcrowded area, half the size of New York City, and they can see this much less crowded, right, much more, more prosperous area on the other side of the barbed wire, which is where they used to live, right? So, like, it seems to me one has to understand these things, right? And that's when I say that Israel doesn't have a Hamas problem, it has a Palestinian problem. It's not to say that I don't think that things Hamas has done are terrible. I think Hamas committed war crimes on October 7th. I'm fundamentally opposed to the targeting of civilians for any reason, regardless of justification. I think those are war crimes. I think they're immoral. And Hamas did it before October 7th. I happen to have a college classmate who was blown up in a Hamas bus bombing in the mid-1990s. Hamas did it in the 1990s. They did it in the 2000s. But Hamas was only created in 1987, right? So if your analysis of the Israel and Palestine is about Israel and Hamas, you have some trouble explaining what happened before 1987. Right? When there was also Palestinian armed resistance. There was all kinds of Palestinian resistance before 1987 as after 1987. A lot of it has been nonviolent. There's a long history of Palestinian boycotts, of Palestinians writing letters, of Palestinians appealing to international institutions, of Palestinians doing general strikes. There's been Palestinian armed resistance against soldiers, and there's been Palestinian armed resistance against civilians. And that didn't start with Hamas, right? In fact, one of the reasons the Israeli government was actually fairly sympathetic to Hamas in the late 1980s when Hamas was created was they couldn't imagine anything worse than the PLO, right? They couldn't imagine anything worse than Fatah and like leftist groups like the PFLP because those groups had been involved in armed resistance, including armed resistance against civilians, right? I mean, who did the Munich massacre, the Munich Olympics attack, right? Who did the Ma'alot massacre in the 1970s, right? The airplane hijacks. None of this was Hamas. These were not Islamists. Hamas didn't exist, right? Israel thought the Islamists were the moderates, right? So this to me is part of just like the problem that we have in so much of the discourse is it doesn't get at that. So then the question is, well, how is Israel going to destroy Hamas, right? I mean, and I can't believe that in the mainstream Jewish discourse that I listen to, and you listen to political discourse, this is still the discourse now. Now Israel's really going to destroy Hamas, right? First of all, Hamas recruits its fighters, as far as I know, as from what I've read, from the families of people that Israel has killed, right? So yes, Israel has killed a lot of people in Hamas, right? It's also created the biggest recruitment bonanza that Hamas could have imagined, right? And from people I know who know Gaza much better than me, they also say that although Israel's destroyed a huge amount of Hamas weaponry, that Hamas is also getting its weaponry is coming from the bombs and ordinances that Israel has dropped on Gaza, which Hamas will now repurpose, right? Just like this is how the Viet Cong fought the United States in Vietnam too. Where were they getting all these weapons? They were our weapons, right? And even if you could destroy Hamas, even if Hamas didn't cease to exist, right? You really think that Palestinians would not create some other vehicle to fight against you if you're holding them under conditions that even Israel's own human rights organizations call apartheid, and a condition in Gaza that now Human Rights Watch and Amnesty in slightly different ways have both categorized as genocide? You think if Hamas wasn't there, that all these people who've seen their families killed, now Gaza, as our colleague Ahmed Moore has just written, has more child amputees than any other place in the world. You think people won't want to fight you? But under some other label or organization? It seems to me the fundamental question is if you don't want people to fight you and kill Israelis, because I know Shaul and I very, very profoundly don't want any Israelis to die, just like we don't want any Palestinians to die, you have to deal with the roots of the problem, with the underlying grievances. And if you don't want people to take up arms, then show them that by not taking up arms, by resisting in another way, they can move towards gaining their freedom. But the people in the Jewish community who denounce Palestinian armed resistance against civilians, which I also oppose, it's not like when Palestinians respond nonviolently, they say, oh, terrific, that's great. We've been saying Palestinians should be Gandhis, and now, lo and behold, you have a nonviolent boycott. You're asking for boycotts. You're going to the International Criminal Court. You're going to the UN. You're doing nonviolent marches like the Great March of Return. No, what do American politicians do? They sanction the International Criminal Court. They basically criminalize nonviolent boycotts and divestment efforts. And then when Palestinians march nonviolently like they did in 2018, Israel sets up these sharpshooters on the fence and they shoot people, basically mostly in the knees and below, and they create thousands and thousands of people who are injured for life. This is not, it seems to me, it's not just immoral, it's not coherent. It's not a coherent way of thinking about how to deal with the problem that you have, because you're living alongside people that you're not giving the basic rights that human beings deserve.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to push you back into the conceptual for a minute.
Sure.
And I want to ask you a question about nationalism. In the book, you quote a very famous citation from Hannah Arendt, where Hannah Arendt says, Jews used to believe in God. Now they only believe in themselves. And there's another line which you didn't quote, but it reminded me of, that Hermann Cohen, the great neo-Kantian philosopher from early 20th century, also not a fan of Zionism, said, Jews used to want to save their souls. Now they only want to save their skin. And it's a very similar type of a sentiment. And so it seems to me that part of the challenge of this, which again was so interesting to me in reading your book and just reading other books like it, is the extent to which the challenge of Zionism as the transformation of the Jews from being a people to being a nation, and the adaptation of nationalism as one solution, in a way, of the Jewish problem. My question is, does the nationalist project itself push in that direction of describing the kinds of things that you're describing, where everything becomes about the collective, everything is about the self, and everything outside of that is just basically, a utility for the survival and the protection of the self? Now, something very understandable about this, post-Shoah, a people that have had experienced the world's historical genocide. This is something that Hannah Arendt was saying, it's not going to work out. You can't take a people that just experienced a genocide and then, put them in charge of other people who and think that that's something good is going to come out of that. And there were all these experiments through the history of Zionism, Buber's Hebrew humanism, and all kinds of, binationalism. And my question to you is like, I don't believe in historical inevitability, but is there something about the very nature of the nationalist project, given the proximate history of the Jews, that pushes in that direction where we get to this point where you're basically, doing the kinds of things that are happening, right? I mean, I don't believe that people are bombed into moderation. I don't think there's a lot of historical precedent for that, right? So how can it be different?
Yeah. Look, I should say, I have been thinking, I wrote in that book that I believe that Israeli Jewish and Palestinian safety are intertwined and interconnected. And I said that as something I believe is a statement of fact, but it's also obviously a kind of moral principle that I believe in. But I will say that there are times that especially in the last few months, that I've thought that maybe I am just totally wrong. I think that what's made me think more about the possibility of being wrong is thinking more about analogies between Israel and Palestine and the United States in the 19th century. Because in some ways it actually turned out that the safety of Americans, who would come to the United States or whatever in the 18th and 19th century and were pushing across the American continent, and the safety of Native Americans were not actually intertwined because the Native American population was destroyed. I mean, not every last Native American was destroyed, but destroyed as a set of peoples, right? They weren't able to wage resistance anymore. I sometimes feel like a 19th century American watching October 7th would have felt they were seeing something very familiar to them, because they would have said, oh yeah, we know exactly what this is. We have groups like Hamas because we have these Native Americans, we've pushed them off their land into these smaller and smaller areas, and we know what happens when they break out of those areas, right? They just killed men, women, and children, right? And America didn't solve that problem with creating a two-state solution along the Mississippi River, or one equal state in which there was a large Native population. It did succeed in destroying, and I guess I was perhaps naively didn't really think up until recently that was really a possibility. But I have come to believe that it's more of a possibility than I had realized. I mean, it is to me. Because, I've just watching the response to the, this is a little afield from your question, but watching the response to the Trump plan just brought home to me so clearly that whatever norms of, limitations that I thought existed in American Jewish discourse, in Israeli Jewish discourse, in a mainstream American political discourse, were largely kind of an illusion, because I remember hearing, I saw not just Netanyahu, but I saw Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, the centrist Israeli politicians. I heard Yair Golan, the head of the Democrats, which is the merger of Meretz and Labor, who said the Trump plan is impractical, but it's a beautiful dream, And then I saw many mainstream American Jewish commentators whose reaction to the Trump plan was things like, well, it's hard to see exactly how it's worked, but maybe we need creative, out-of-the-box thinking. We need some kind of new paradigm. After all, maybe people would be better off. After all, Gaza is really so terrible. I'm like, oh, you just realized that things in Gaza are terrible now? Because I thought the day before yesterday you were telling me things weren't so bad. Now all of a sudden they're so terrible that people need to leave, right? And like I feel like the day before yesterday, if I had suggested that large scales of many Israeli politicians would be openly supporting mass expulsion, you would have said, how dare you slander Israel by claiming that people want forced expulsion? But then when they embrace forced expulsion, then everyone just justifies that. It's like there's this sliding scale, and I think that, to go back to your question about whether this was inevitable, I think it's a cliche almost, but Israel's Zionist movement and then Israel's view has always been, how can you have as much land as possible with as few Palestinians as possible? So if that's your attitude, then I think that an effort to have fewer and fewer Palestinians, this is not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where more and more people are being forced out of Area C and other parts of the West Bank and just crowded into smaller and smaller areas where their lives are more and more and more impossible. A Palestinian friend of mine was from the West Bank was just saying to me, he said, something along the lines of, so many times in so many ways, the state says to me, we'd really rather you not be here. And so I do think that's always been there, and I think there's something dangerous, I guess, about saying, I'm so always structural, I don't know, like when people are willing to say, even Chuck Schumer in his book, he's willing to say things about Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, right, that suggest that they're really beyond the pale, right? He calls them Jewish supremacists, right? And he says that, but what exactly are Ben-Gvir and Smotrich wanting to do that David Ben-Gurion and a young Yitzhak Rabin didn't do in 1948? I mean, they expelled a lot more Palestinians than Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have done. So these things are in the Israel's political DNA, and I do think it has to do with the fundamental problem of how are you going to create a state for Jews, of Jews, by Jews, in a place where so many of the people are not Jews, right? You either have to get rid of a lot of them, or you have to hold them in some kind of subordinate situation. And I think Israel has, Israel has tried both of those efforts. And now that the other solutions, like partition, which gives them their own state, now that that's really not on the table, and given that the idea of treating them equally and giving them equal citizenship is completely not on the table, I think basically the mainstream conversation is moving more and more towards how can we impose more and more pressure so that we have fewer Palestinians around. And it's really a horrifying thing to watch, and it's also for me a horrifying thing to see people justify and yet be able to have so much mainstream credibility in our community and in American politics and in Israel, even as they justify things that I naively thought, people would simply recognize as fundamentally, profoundly wrong.
Yeah, I was reminded when you were saying in 1948 there was a very big debate. It was really a national debate after the establishment of the state about whether to let many of those refugees back into the country. And Martin Buber made a very, very, very impassioned speech to a group of people, including David Ben-Gurion, arguing that if the new country of Israel would not let those refugees back, it will be a moral stain on the country. And Ben-Gurion, who was a leftist, Ben-Gurion's response was, as you said, literally his response was, the fewer Arabs, the better.
Right.
That was the national project from the beginning.
Right.
So
now that when Israel, one of the things I think that the more successful Israel is in doing this, it seems to me the more it becomes a template for many other governments around the world that also have disposable populations that they would also really just not like to have around. I mean, I just always imagine like someone like Narendra Modi, with his Muslim problem in India, watching what Israel is saying, wow, like this is an option for us. And I just fear that, especially with the ethnic cleansing that happened in Nagorno-Karabakh of Armenians by Azerbaijan the summer of 2023, I feel like this is also just laying the foundation for a whole new era of ethnic cleansing around the world.
I have two questions. Maybe I'll ask them to, well, I'll ask one and then the other because they're actually quite different. There's a lot of comparison in the book. It's actually interesting, not only in terms of the South African case and your own personal autobiography, and there are a lot of people who are defenders of what's going on in Israel that really try to deflect any comparison, as if to say this is a case for which there is no comparison.
Right.
Now, having a son and a father-in-law who are both political scientists, political scientists cannot tolerate that. The idea that there's something that's sui generis.
Right.
Now, everything is different from everything else, but everything can be compared in some way. And it seems what comes out of your comparison is pushing back against, I think you maybe mentioned it a couple of times, this notion of somehow Israeli exceptionalism.
Right.
That Israel is an exceptional case, either because of the Holocaust or because of a variety of other things. And I think that there's a deep fissure in the ability for the collective, many of whom want peace, many of whom want a better place, many of whom recognize the rights of self-determination. But because it's embedded in this exceptionalism, it almost prevents any kind of movement towards a resolution, because anytime you compare it, whether it's Ireland or whether it's South Africa, there's always going to be the attempt to say, no, this is different, and therefore those solutions could never work in this case.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to try to write about in the book, which is, especially to a Jewish audience, was just to try to get across the idea that other groups of people who had legal supremacy were also really terrified. That this sense that Israeli Jews have, and many, many non-Israeli Jews have, that it's just obvious that if you got rid of this system of legal supremacy, that your life would be in grave danger. That it's so obvious that when people challenge it, you look at them like they're nuts, right? Which is the way people look at me sometimes. That I just want to try to make the point that that's not unique to Jews, and it's not uniquely a product of the history of anti-Semitism and the Shoah. That it's actually maybe pretty typical of people who become accustomed to legal supremacy, that they associate equality with death, or at least with subjugation, right? That is really, you have a lot of white American discourse in the 19th century, and which basically says, if we don't have slaves, we will be the slaves. That was like a really typical thing to say in 19th century America. Yeah. And I was really, I spent part of my childhood in South Africa, so I was surrounded by people for whom the idea that you could have a free election which would bring a black majority government and they could still be safe was just considered absurd. It was just considered absurd. And I think that part of the problem is now we look back in these moments and we think, oh, those benighted racists, like how, we can't imagine, they were just such idiots and they were so profoundly immoral. But when you're in that discourse, it seems completely plausible, right? I mean, and it was plausible for Protestants in Northern Ireland too, in which is I quote Ian Paisley, the Protestant leader, who says on the eve of the Good Friday Agreement, this is a prelude to genocide, right? Protestants were terrified of the IRA. And they hated the IRA, right? Like with a burning amount of passion, right? They had seen the IRA, doing terrible, terrible things, killing lots and lots of people, killing civilians. White South Africans were terrified of the ANC. Growing up, I literally even never heard the term. I remember feeling like I never heard the term African National Congress without the adjectives communist terrorist before it, right? We forget that part, but it was communist. I mean, they were getting their weapons from the Soviet Union, and they were considered a terrorist organization by the United States, and they were using armed resistance. It's only the American discourses like turned Nelson Mandela into Martin Luther King or Gandhi. He wasn't. He was actually one of the people who moved the ANC away from nonviolent resistance. They believed in armed resistance, and so the logic was, listen, maybe our system of supremacy is not pretty. Maybe it's not great. Maybe in some distant future it would be better if we had some situation. But in this here and now, people are trying to kill us. They're obviously clearly trying to kill us. The reason that they're not surviving, able to kill us, is that we have this defense. We have this shield of the state. And now you, in your ivory tower liberal somewhere, I mean, this is the way white South Africans looked at the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. I remember it because I was in high school and in college with these anti-apartheid activists, and then I would go to talk to my relatives in South Africa, and they'd be like, these people seriously want us to take away the thing which is protecting our lives and put ourselves at the mercy of these people who we have evidence are trying to kill us? Why on earth would we do that, right? And I think the reason that those white South Africans and Protestants in Northern Ireland turned out to be, and white Americans turned out to be wrong, is that they were not really seeing those people on the other side of the divide truly as human. And they couldn't really understand that this violence was a response to a system of violence, right? Which is what Martin Luther King was trying to say again and again and again. Every time there was violence, there were riots in major cities, and he would say, listen, you can't see this in isolation. You can't see this, and if you see it in isolation, you're going to be basically involved in a discourse of racist discourse, right? In which this is just kind of the way black people are, right? And so I feel like, it turned out that once black people in South Africa got the vote, they had a mechanism for government to be responsive to them. And Mkhonto Wesizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, didn't need to exist. And that the IRA stopped blowing things up, not because all everyone in the IRA were such nice people, by the way, they really weren't all such nice people, but because they had a mechanism which didn't put their lives at risk, in which they could actually advocate for having a decent life. And I get so frustrated. I mean, you've heard this line, I'm sure, all the time that I do, where people will say to me, Peter, what you're saying is really nice in the abstract, but you just don't understand that Israel is in the Middle East. Which reminds me so much of the way white South Africans talked about Africa, which was also, by the way, Africa in the 1980s, if you looked north of the Limpopo River, didn't look like the countries were thriving that much, right? It looked like a bunch of dictatorships and civil wars and corrupt, dysfunctional places, right? And so it wasn't look like you would look at Congo or Zimbabwe or Nigeria and Kenya and say, this is a glittering future for us, right? And I was really struck reading the book by how much Protestants in Northern Ireland saw Catholic Ireland in similar ways to the way so many Jews see the Arab world, and so many white South Africans saw the African continent as this sea of backwardness and savagery. But I just never heard a black South African say, you have to understand we're in Africa, and I never hear Palestinians say, you have to understand we're in the Middle East. And it's not because Palestinians look at Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Iraq and think these countries are fabulous models of what they want. It's just that they have an understanding of why there may be a lot of corruption and dictatorship and violence, which is not basically based on some essentialized racist view of, well, that's just the way these people are, right? They can see that it has to do with the legacy of colonialism, and it has to do with the legacy of the Cold War, and partly we don't have democracies in the Middle East because America doesn't want to have democracies in the Middle East, and a whole series of things, right? And so it doesn't lead you to this place. And so I feel like, to me, that's the value of sometimes in this trying to de-exceptionalize the Jewish and Israel conversation, and then be able to imagine us in the position of these other peoples, and then maybe be able to imagine us in the places that they are now, where they're no longer in supremacist systems, and not everything is perfect, but they're not actually in grave danger, and they're actually grateful, for the most part, that they're no longer living in supremacist systems.
Right. I want to pull you from Ireland, South Africa, Israel, Palestine to America. And I want to ask two final questions about America and Jews in America, and what I see, at least from where I sit, a pretty serious, I wouldn't call it a generation gap, it's more like a generation rupture that's happening.
Yeah.
And the two questions are as follows. There seems to be an unspoken fusion between Zionism and Jewishness in America that has developed over the last half century in all kinds of ways.
Right.
And I think that what October 7th and the war has shattered that fusion, or at least pressed very hard against it, and then there's obviously a lot of reaction back. So my question is that what you would call the Zionist consensus, or what sociologists call the Zionist consensus, which really happens in America in the 1970s, post 67 and then post Yom Kippur War, that the Zionist consensus is over. That's a question, not a statement, right? And by that, I don't mean that Americans won't be Zionists. What I mean is that when we talk about a Zionist consensus, we're really talking about a kind of liberal Zionist consensus. And that it seems to me what's happened is that's collapsed. The middle has collapsed, and that people have moved to the right or to the left. And there's this kind of empty space. So I wanted to ask you to kind of weigh in on that, because it seems to me that from where I sit, like, American Jewry is broken right now. There's a rupture. People can't talk to each other. They can't talk to each other about Israel. They can't talk to each other about anti-Semitism. They can't talk to each other about the American political system. Something is has deeply kind of shaken the entire American Jewish community that has existed fairly stable for the last half century. So if you can kind of speak to that, and like, is there somewhere it can go? I mean, that came out in the Jewish left conferences at BU in a number of ways. The emergence of the term anti-Zionism as a functioning term that didn't exist 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I do think that there is not a Zionist, if by Zionist we mean support for a state that gives Jews legal supremacy over Palestinians, I do think that consensus has really eroded, and I don't think there is a consensus anymore. And there's certainly not a consensus among people under the age of 40. And one of the problems we have is that the people who tend to do polling about this tend to generally be from the mainstream Jewish organizations that are really, really interested in showing that there is this consensus. But actually, if you kind of look at what happens when people ask slightly more on different kinds of questions, you actually see these things are really exposed really clearly, right? So like, so in 2021, we had a poll which showed that 38% of American Jews under the age of 40 think Israel's practicing apartheid. And then last year, we had a poll which said that 30% of American Jews think Israel's committing genocide, right? And
under 40, the under 40.
I know it was 30 overall, and among under 44, it was 38%, right? So these are not positions that the organized American Jewish community thinks are wrong. These are positions that the organized American Jewish community thinks are prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism, right? So in a strange way, if the American Jewish establishment were being honest, they would say, we have a very serious anti-Semitism problem amongst young American Jews. Because many of them are expressing positions that we now consider anti-Semitic. And Mira Sukharov, our friend, basically did this. She did this smart thing where she just didn't ask American Jews if they were Zionists, but she gave different definitions of Zionism. And so when she asked American Jews, do you consider yourself a Zionist if it means that Jews have rights that are superior to Palestinians? Most said no, right? So it actually suggests that there's a lot more fragility to this supposed consensus than people would suggest. I think, though, what seems to me to be happening, and I'm actually writing something about this now, is that as more and more Jews defect from, political Zionism, right, from the idea of a Jewish state, what's happened is deeply embedded in American discourse has been the equation of being Jewish and being pro-Israel or being Zionist, right? And so actually, I think the way the political system is metabolizing this and the way the organized American Jewish community is metabolizing this is, in fact, if you leave the Zionist consensus, you actually aren't Jewish anymore. Trump said this in his own particularly depraved way, right? When he said that Chuck Schumer is not a Jew, he's a Palestinian. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant to be Jewish is to be supportive of Israel to a certain level, and Schumer dipped below that. So congratulations, he's now Palestinian, right? And but I don't think Trump came up with this on his own. Trump was very crudely restating something which is very common in mainstream American Jewish discourse, which is to say, if Jewishness and Zionism are inseparable, then if you're not a Zionist, you're actually not really Jewish. And I think that actually, if you look at the way, again, I'm writing about this, but if you look at the way that people respond to what happens on college campuses, this actually is what happens. Because, so for instance, I went looking for this piece I'm writing to try to figure out how many sukkahs had been forcibly dismantled by college administrations last fall, right? And it turns out there were roughly about 10. On 10 different campuses, Jews had built sukkahs, which is supposedly a good Jewish thing to do around Sukkot, right? It's kind of what you're supposed to do, right? And the universities dismantled the sukkahs. They literally sent people with hammers, like break them down, right? So now, if that's all you knew about this, you might think the Anti-Defamation League would be concerned about this, right? This might actually even sound like anti-Semitism if Jews are not allowed to practice their core tenets of their religion, right? No, the ADL was thrilled with this. The ADL was pushing for this to happen because it just happened that these were Gaza Gaza solidarity sukkahs, right? Which meant that they weren't really sukkahs, and the Jewish kids who were building them weren't really Jews. So they were not classified as Jews, right? So many of the kids who are now and have been getting expelled, suspended, arrested, and the punishments are going up and up and up because the pressure is not just on the federal government, but it's from the organized American Jewish organizations to be harsher and harsher and harsher. A remarkably high percentage of those young people are Jews, right? And I think it's partly because actually they may have had a greater expectation of safety than the Palestinian and Arab and Muslim and black students, which is part of the reason they were so overrepresented in these moves, because they thought that being Jewish, and most of them would be considered white, that they actually had a safety. What they didn't realize was that they were not going to be classified as Jews in the discourse of American politics and of the discourse of their own community. And so then when they got suspended and expelled and beaten up and arrested, right, that the Jewish organizations would applaud. Right? Which is what they've done, right? So when Columbia suspended Jewish Voice for Peace, the ADL said, we thank Columbia for keeping Jewish students safe, right? Well, not those Jewish students, right? At your former campus, when Dartmouth called in the New Hampshire police and they zip-tied, right, and dragged across the ground, right, the former head of the Jewish Studies program. So this poor woman still has nerve damage from this, according to this, right? The ADL thanked Dartmouth for creating a climate of safety on campus, right? And so this, I think, is what's happened as the result of this fracturing of the consensus, is that it's meant the redefinition of what it means to be a Jew.
No, I mean, it's captured in this article, I think it was 2022, written by Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky, called
The
Unjew.
Absolutely. They were leading indicators of this. They were early to this, right?
Well, we're running out of time, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Sponsor, the Religion, Conflict and Peace Initiative at Religion and Public Life.
Copyright 2025, President and Fellows of Harvard College.